it's a book and an organisation. Both of them share one single aim, which is ending mass impoverishment through peaceful means. And mass impoverishment, which Emma mentioned, is what happens when most people in society find themselves getting poorer year on year instead of richer. So if I think about my own family, my parents, like most people in their generation, were better off than their parents had been. And I, like most people in my generation, am better off than my parents were. And when my children were born, I took it as it was a law of nature that they would have a very good chance of becoming better off than I am. But even while I was still at PA, it began to dawn on me that things just weren't working that way, and that if we didn't change tack, we were looking at the first generation in living memory to be poorer than their parents. So if there's time afterwards, I'll tell you the story of how that happened to me while I was at PA. But in short, the more I looked at the data, the more concerned I became about this process of mass impoverishment. So in the end, I decided to leave PA and write this book. So there is a picture of the book. And the book itself actually is split into three parts. The first part of the book explores mass impoverishment and what will happen to the UK if we just continue on the path that we've been on in recent years. The second part explores the reasons why we haven't changed direction, which is principally because we've been persuaded that we haven't really got any options open to us, that there is no alternative. And the third part of the book spells out actually what the alternative is and the type of actions that we need to take in order to build an attractive future. So most people are not really aware of it, but in the UK, although the economy has grown since then, most people are actually worse off today than they were in 2007, which is 13 years ago. So that is something that I never expected to see in my lifetime, 13 years of basically falling wages. So as you can see from this chart, the last 10 or 13 years have been dreadful. But actually the problem runs deeper than that. If you think about it, most of us can see from our own experience how different, not the younger ones, but some of us can anyway, how different the deal on offer to somebody of 20 today is from the equivalent deal 40 years ago. In those days, if you were bright, the state would not only pay your university tuition fees, but it would actually give you a maintenance grant. So you would leave university without debt. And when you left, there were plenty of proper jobs available to you. By proper job, I mean a job that would offer a reasonable salary, good security, attractive career prospects, and even things like defined benefit pensions, which of course hardly exist nowadays. In those days, somebody on average earnings would need to save up for about 7 or 8 years to be able to afford to pay the deposit on an average house. Nowadays, the equivalent figure is about more than 35 years. So let's just think about where we could be heading over the next few decades. So the median earner in 2019, so that's before all the COVID, took home about £25,000. And if we extrapolate the pre-2010 trends forward to the year 2050, then we see that by 2050, that typical person would be earning almost 35,000, which is a long way from being luxurious, but of course it's dramatically better than today. So we could be looking at a very attractive future. And that's on the pre-2010 trends, which themselves weren't fantastic, because that included the negative impact of the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. But if we were to extrapolate the post-2010 trends, then that same typical person by 2050 would be earning less than 20,000, which is a big reduction. And if we were to follow COVID with another serious round of austerity, it could be something like 16,000. So we could, if we're not careful, turn the UK from what it has been throughout my lifetime, which is a prosperous Northern European country, into something whose profile is much more like South Africa today, where you have a tiny wealthy elite who live surrounded by security which protects them from the mass of the population who are living either in or not very, very far above the poverty line. So in the past, when there have been crises, then governments have taken radical steps to improve matters. In the US, in the middle of in the depths of the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced a New Deal. And that involved enormous investments in infrastructure and job creation schemes in order to bring down unemployment and to create a fair world and a future for ordinary people. In this country, after the Second World War, with a war-damaged economy and, of course, a huge and now largely redundant army, Clement Attlee implemented the Beveridge Report and invested to create the welfare state and the National Health Service. And we're, of course, still enjoying the benefits of those investments today. And yet there isn't any serious discussion of any kind of New Deal now. Why not? Well, one reason is that we've been persuaded that it would just be unaffordable to think that way. First, we had the global financial crisis. Now we've had COVID, and we've been told that that's left the government with an unprecedented level of debt. We've been told that that will all have to be paid back. We've been told that therefore we need to be realistic and responsible about thinking about spending and investing to preserve jobs and regenerate the economy. And I used to believe all of that myself until I started looking at the data. So this is from the Bank of England. They have actually they've now got a millennium of economic history, but this is the last 300 years of debt to GDP, with the latest bit stuck on from the Office for Budget Responsibility. So very roughly speaking, our debt to GDP ratio today is around 100%. But that green line that runs across the middle of the chart, that's the average of the last 300 years. So what you can see is that 100%, although it's higher than we are used to, is by no means unprecedented. It's actually the average of the last 300 years. If you look, you can see there are a couple of peaks there. There's one around 1820, which was just about the time that the Industrial Revolution really took off, and it was over 200% then. And another one, of course, at the end of the Second World War in 1945, debt to GDP was over 250%. But the Industrial Revolution and the golden age of capitalism that followed the war were the two most successful periods in our economic history. So not only should we not be panicking that we've just about hit the average, even if it were quite a long way above the average, that doesn't in any way imply that we couldn't be looking to have a very successful period. We could afford to spend in 1820 and in 1945, and we did, and the benefits were enormous. We could easily afford to spend now. So if we don't, that's a political choice. It's not an economic necessity. In fact, it's economic illiteracy to do that. So if we do have freedom to act, what actions should we take? Well, actually, surprisingly, only 5 actions we need to take, and none of them in themselves are particularly difficult or particularly radical. It's mainly that it's a mindset shift. So the first action is that we need a democratic reset. We need some constitutional reform. At the moment, there's nothing in our unwritten constitution that prevents a government from enacting a policy that it knows would be harmful for most people in the population. We've simply always taken it for granted that no government would ever do such a thing. But the last 10 years have demonstrated that we can't rely just on taking it for granted. We need a formal constitutional protection with teeth for the bottom 99% of the population. We also need much more in the way of checks and balances than we have at the moment. Looking at what happened in the States in January, it shows how fragile democracy is and how it risks being captured by powerful interests that really represent only a tiny fraction of the population. The same thing is true here. We need to learn from that experience. The second action is also self-evident, really. We need to base policy on facts, not myths. The dominant policy of the last decade has been austerity. That's conditioned our response to virtually everything. And that was justified on the basis of the state of public finances, the level of debt to GDP, meaning that there was no alternative. But we've just seen that actually that is not true. that whole austerity was based on a myth. It wasn't based on the facts. So having facts as the foundation is vital to good policy making. The third step builds on the foundation of those two, which is to develop policies which both grow the pie, the economic pie, and share it fairly so that everybody in society benefits. Now, of course, it's true that policy formulation is very complicated, but fundamentally there are only 4 types of policy. Every policy either does grow the pie or it doesn't grow the pie, and it either shares the pie fairly or it does not. So that gives us a picture that looks, I'll just stick to it, a picture that looks a bit like this, with 4 boxes, depending on whether you do share the pie, whether you do grow the pie or not. So at the top right, we've got shared growth policies, which both grow the pie and share it fairly. So that would be things like investment in fundamental research, something we've been spending far less on in recent years than in the past, even though it's an engine of future prosperity, or education or infrastructure or healthcare. All of those sorts of things benefit everybody in society, and they benefit the economy as a whole. So we need to see far more of those sorts of things. At the top left, we've got what we've called captured growth policies, which they do grow the pie, but they don't share it fairly. So that the reality is the economy as a whole gets bigger, but some people actually get a lot poorer. For example, if we have very aggressive automation, that could enable us to produce, as an economy, to produce far more in the way of valuable goods and services for people than we produce today, and society as a whole would be better off. But you can easily imagine that many individuals could lose their jobs with aggressive automation. And so what you could see is the pie growing, but a lot of people actually seeing their slices shrink. So that brings us to the need for these type 4 policies on the bottom right, balancing policies, which you use to balance the type 1 policies. So if we did have very aggressive automation, then we could think about how to balance it. Some of that might be through things like direct job creation. Some of it might be retraining so that people can get other existing jobs. And some of the balancing might need to come from things like strengthening the safety net. But the key point is that there needs to be a set of balancing policies. A good policy portfolio is a balanced policy portfolio. And then finally, we've got the type 3 policies on the bottom, which are what we've called vulture policies, because they neither grow the pie nor share it fairly. They enable a tiny group of people to get rich, but at everybody else's expense. So actually, a hard Brexit is an example of that. The government's own analysis said that a hard Brexit would shrink the pie. If you shrink the pie, of course, some people's slices have to shrink. You can't have everybody's slices growing if the pie shrinks. So what happens then is many people are going to suffer, even if some hedge fund managers will do extremely well out of it. So we simply should avoid vulture policies altogether. And if we look at this picture, we can see that over the last 10 years, the main reason for a lot of our problems is that we've had a lot of type 1 and type 3 policies and far too few type 2 and type 4 policies on the right. What would have happened if we shifted policy formulation to have a balanced portfolio with some type 1, balanced with type 4, and lots more type 2 policies? Well, it wouldn't create utopia, but it would bring us back to that kind of attractive world that we talked about before in 2050, where the coming generations have a reasonable expectation of being substantially better off than today, and therefore younger people have a very appealing future to look forward to. So I'll just nip back to the previous chart, just quickly to cover steps 4 and 5. So the 4th action is to invest wisely in the future. So that relates to those type 2 policies we were just talking about. For the last 10 years, definitely, but actually longer than that, we have been unwisely underinvesting in the future. And of course, the longer you do that, there's a cumulative drag from that underinvestment. So we need to reverse that. And the 5th action is ensuring clean, competitive markets. So what that means is making sure that ethical businesses will outcompete the unethical ones. And of course, there's a conventional story of business that says they will do that anyway, because if you treat your customers well, then they should be more loyal. If you treat your employees fairly, then they'll more than repay that with commitment and creativity. If you contribute to the rest of society, you'll be rewarded for being a good corporate citizen. And you certainly can find examples of companies which behave ethically and do well. When I tried to find the top 10 in the UK, I came up with a list that included Pucketees, Neal's Yard, Triodos, and Ecova. So they're all names that you've probably heard of, but they're not the biggest companies in the world. If we look at the companies that are the biggest companies in the world, what do we see? Well, 5 huge companies now make up 20% of the entire market value of the S&P 500. Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. All 5 of those companies are under investigation for anti-competitive behavior. All 5 of them avoid their taxes. Amazon is notorious for the way it treats its workers, and Facebook has been complicit in serious abuses of democracy. So are those the 5 most ethical companies in America? Well, I certainly hope they're not. So what is really happening here? Well, in practice, one of the easiest ways to boost profit is to externalize your costs. So if I run a business and I am not carbon neutral, I'm polluting and I'm not paying the cost of the damage that that does. I'm not bearing that cost the rest of society does. If I avoid my taxes, but I'm still driving on the roads and using all sorts of other things which are provided by taxes, actually I'm getting an involuntary subsidy from the rest of society. Or you could even think of it as a kind of theft, really. But anyway, it's at the very least, it's an involuntary subsidy. If I don't pay my staff a living wage, but of course I expect them to be living when they turn up to work, somebody else is paying that. Either the bank of mum and dad or those people are getting in-work benefits, but somehow or other, the rest of society is paying part of my wage bill. And so by behaving unethically, I've created a lower cost base than an ethical business would have. And that means I have a competitive advantage. And if nothing is done about it, I can drive my competitors out of business. So there's a real danger of bad businesses driving the good ones out rather than the other way around. Amazon actually exemplifies the power of externalization as a competitive weapon. It's competitively a tremendously powerful business, but a big part of that is because it's not really covering its own cost base. We are subsidizing it. So at the moment, the playing field's tilted against ethical businesses, and we need to level it to make sure that the ethical businesses can outcompete the unethical ones rather than the other way around. So those are the 5 key actions. And in a sense, I've given you a very brief summary of the book. I've talked about what happens if we don't change. I've talked about at least one of the reasons for believing that we can change. And I've talked very briefly about the actions that we need to take. So that the book that I showed the picture of earlier was published in September 2019. And of course, I hoped it would do well. And I was delighted later that year when the Financial Times chose it as one of their books of the year. But at the same time, I was under no illusion that the book itself would have any impact whatsoever on the future direction of the UK. So with a few friends and with my wife, I set up the 99% organization. And the purpose of the organization is to raise awareness of those issues and to drive policy change along the lines of what we've just been talking about. So this is a picture of what we're building. At the top, we've got policymakers, and to achieve the kinds of changes that we need, of course, we need policy change. And there are essentially 650 people in the UK who determine that policy, our MPs. So if we can help them to formulate better policy, fact-based policy, then we can expect to see the whole population benefit from that. But of course, each MP is responsible principally to his or her own constituents, and they're responsive to those people. So if I write to my MP, I should get a reply, but if I write to your MP, they don't have to take any notice of me. So to be able to have any impact on them, we need local groups, ideally in as many constituencies as possible. And to do that, we will need a very large number of members of the 99% organisation, possibly ending up with tens of thousands up to 100,000 members. And membership's also important because we're entirely volunteer organisation. We haven't got a single paid employee. So our ability to do anything at all depends on having members. And we've grown quite rapidly. So we're coming up towards 1,000 members now. And that's enabled us to kick off 5 important projects. The first one is, well, I've got them in a different order, but I'll do them in the order I've got them up here. Externalization. Externalization, that is the problem of businesses getting the rest of society to bear their costs. So we have a project whose first phase is finished. We ran the first phase jointly with Imperial College, the Impact Management Project, which is an organization that coordinates the international accounting standards setters and the Institute for Public Policy Research, looking at how to change, ultimately to change the accounting standards so that profit is corrected for those externalized costs. So it's re-engineering the profit motive into a force for good. The next one is all party parliamentary groups. So we're not a party political organization. We'll talk to anybody who supports our objective from any party. So for that reason, our main approach to MPs is via these all party parliamentary groups, because by definition they're all party. So we have reached out to several of them, and where we see a strong alignment of interests, and we have some dialogue going, most particularly with the Future Generations All Party Parliamentary Group, which is jointly sponsored by Lord Bird in the House of Lords and Caroline Lucas in the Commons. And last week, actually, Caroline Lucas made her sort of first public statement endorsing 99%, which was very nice. We have the local action groups, which do what you would expect them to do. They help people in the local areas to raise the profile of these issues, to get into the local press. I think they've had 2 articles published in the last week in local press, and to reach out to MPs and candidates in local areas. And then we have 2 that I'm not really going to talk about. Generation 99, which Owen's going to talk about, which is really just, I've talked quite a bit about the year 2050, and I'm very much hoping that I shall be there to see and enjoy the year 2050, but I shall no longer be at the height of my powers. But anybody who's under 30 today will be at the height of their powers. It'll be their world in 2050. And so this project is really to energize and empower those people. But I'm not going to say any more about that because Owen will. And the last one on the list is Herefordshire 2030. So most of what I've talked about has been about top-down change of government policy and so on. And that, of course, is vital, but it could take a very long time to achieve. So this project is a bit different. It's talking about bottom-up change. What could one region, which in this case happens to be Herefordshire, do without waiting for that central change to make the county greener, fairer, and more prosperous by 2030 than it is today? So Jeremy is about to tell us all of that. So I know I've cantered through a lot of stuff there, but I hope I've given you a flavour for what we're trying to achieve with the book and with the organisation, which is very simply to end mass impoverishment, to create a world that's fit for future generations, which is greener, fairer, and more prosperous than today. So that is all I was planning to say, and I guess it's over to Jeremy now.
Well, Mark, do you want, there are a couple of questions on the chat. Do you want to take those now?
I'm happy to take them now. The questions then. Oh, yes. Perspective internationally from Chris Lee. Yes and no. It's quite a bit of work to do the analysis that we did for each country. And so we've actually only got a decent quality of analysis for the UK and the US. So we don't have it internationally. I know that there are quite a lot of other countries that have a problem of mass impoverishment, but whereas we have quite a lot of analysis of the UK and the US. We only have a very superficial understanding of other countries. So Adrian has said, COVID is teaching us the societal value of key or frontline workers, but do you see any evidence that this is being reflected in them getting a bigger slice of the pie? At the moment, I would say absolutely not. They're continuing to see their slices shrink. I think you're right, though, that it has raised awareness of the value of those key and frontline workers, which I'm hoping will make it easier to redress the balance in the future. But right now, absolutely no evidence whatsoever.
I've got a couple of other questions that were a direct message to me. David Shannon asked 2 or 3, so I'll do them one by one. Would you please define better off, given that GDP is a rubbish concept and it's not GDP per head?
Well, better off is something that we all have an instinctive understanding of. It's how much money does each household actually have? And that's the problem, that many households have, in real terms, less money than they had before. They still have to pay their rent, they still have to heat their houses, they still have to feed their kids, and they've got less money than before.
Okay, part 2 from them. Have you read Prosperity Without Growth, and is that a viable model?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by without growth. This is actually it's a very good question. It's quite a big one, so I'll have to go quickly through the answer. If we simply grow the way we have been growing, that will be an environmental disaster. But if you think of every human activity, you can put it into one of 3 buckets. There's a good bucket. There are activities like planting trees or insulating houses, which are good. They create jobs, they are good for the economy, but they're also good for the environment. In fact, planting trees is really the only proven technology we have for carbon capture and storage at the moment. So those things are in the good bucket. We should be growing those. So nobody that I've come across has told me that they are against good growth. Then you've got a middle bucket, which are things that we really want to be doing. There's a good reason for us to do them, but we need to find a different way from the way we're doing it now. Agriculture is a good example there, because agriculture currently generates enormous amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. And if we carry on with agriculture the way we are doing it now, then again, we would have enormous difficulty in avoiding a climate catastrophe. The Lancet last year published something called the planetary diet, which calculated that if we were to engineer a culture change so that we don't need everybody to become vegan, but if people switched to a plant-rich diet with much less meat in than they typically eat today, we would be able to feed 10 billion people, and we would not, in fact, create as much environmental damage. But in fact, the news is better than that, because if you stop using nearly so much land for livestock is a very, very inefficient way of generating calories for people to eat. So if you stop using it so much for that, you reduce that enormously, then you have more land that you can use for arable farming, which is much more efficient. And actually, you don't need to use it all for that, because it is much more efficient, which means you've created a lot of spare land that you can put trees on. So if you were to combine a culture change in terms of diet, a culture change in terms of reduction of food waste in the home, and using those to change land use dramatically and to increase forest cover dramatically, you could see something between 50 to 100% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So you've got that second bucket, which are things that need to be transformed, the could be good bucket. And then finally, you've got the bad bucket, which are things that you can't find a way to transform. There's no way that I'm aware of anyway, that you can transform the burning of fossil fuels and stop it from being environmentally damaging. So those things, if you grow those, you are actively worsening things. So actually we should be looking to shrink those. So it's not as simple as saying we should be pro-growth or anti-growth. What it is really is we should be pro-good growth. We should be investing in transformation of the could be good things, and we should be shrinking as fast as we possibly can the things that are in the bad bucket. So that was quite a long answer, but it's a very deep question.
The third of David's 5 that I'm going to go with is when we reduced our national debt, that was when we were pulling wealth out of India, etc. To which I think the answer, my quick answer is yes, exactly in the 1800s, but not in the 1950s.
Yeah, in fact, I've looked over the last 300 years, as you saw, not just in that one chart, but also in what drives that ratio. And the answer is, in the last 300 years, there's only ever been one thing that has reduced the ratio of debt to GDP, which is growth. So any proposed solution that doesn't involve growth isn't going to work. So in other words, austerity, which as we now know is very bad for growth, has no possibility of doing any good in any way, but specifically not in terms of containing debt to GDP.
Okay, last one before we move on. Bill Newton asks, leaping right back to the beginning, what sort of constitutional reform measures?
Well, there are 5 things that we are saying. The first one I mentioned, which is that it should be an explicit constitutional duty and an enforceable duty of any elected government to govern on behalf of the whole population, and the measures of government performance should be changed. So it's been pointed out that GDP isn't a good measure. That's true. It's really not a good measure. As we can see, particularly in America, you can have dramatic growth in GDP without most people getting any benefit at all from it. So we need to change the measures as well. We need to have, as part of that democratic reform, we need separation of powers. We can see the danger if you allow capture of one part of the elite, such as government, to enable you also to capture the press and then the judiciary and so on. Your ability to sustain a functioning democracy goes. So there's a series of issues around that, which would include having better control over the media, and include taking real steps to avoid essentially damaging propaganda. So if you have people in a position of public authority who mislead the public, there should be serious penalties for that, because it's very, very dangerous. It undermines democracy. So I think there are about 5 separate recommendations, which are not all at the top of my mind in the book, for what that democratic reform would need to look like. Okay,
I'm going to hand over to Jeremy in a second, but I will get in a quick ad from my forthcoming book, Creating the World We Want to Live in. And in there you will find references to 2 things that kind of answer things that people have said. One is the World Happiness Report, which, despite its horrible name, has a lot of the data that Chris Lee was looking for. And the other is Barry Brooks brought up the Wellbeing Act in Wales, when I point at the network of wellbeing governments, which includes Scotland, New Zealand, Iceland, and a few others. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. You're moving on from the intellectual wing of PA to the horny-handed sons of toil out of projects. I'm not quite sure how I got involved in a project regarding Herefordshire, a county which I've never knowingly set foot in, unless I got lost going off the motorway at some stage. But I got my collar felt by Mark many months ago, and found myself in an old project management role. I had to remember some of the old tricks. And in this case, we have a project, as Mark said, which is to take some of the principles that he has just outlined and try and apply it to one county of about 2 million people, a very attractive county according to the pictures. As I say, I've not been there. And see what could be done locally. We have a group which is, of course, met entirely on this sort of medium, made up of volunteers who have been looking at aspects of the of life in Herefordshire and how can it be made more prosperous, fairer, and greener. We did the proper project thing. We defined what we were trying to do. We built up a team. We set a plan, which we've met some of the milestones, and we set out having just defined our work streams, and these were the initial work streams we had, which you'll see in the dark blue is pretty well aligned with those 3 objectives of which Mark has described, and a 4th which we've still not yet really got to, which is what are the other enabling acts. If we look at those 3 blobs, analyze what could be improved by the people of Herefordshire in Herefordshire, that then there might under those 3 blobs there will be some other things which could enable the improvements to be both accelerated and delivered. So I'm just going to show you some of the analysis. There's been a wealth of work done by people who really have got trying to do this all in either their spare time or haven't got they've not had the consulting training or the research training, but there've been a wealth of enthusiasm built up in this team. And these are just some of the slides that have been produced. So one of the things is we wanted to scotch the view early on that that Herefordshire is in some way a real outlier. Well, it's actually not. It's almost Middle England defined. It's and is representative of many overall in terms of disposable income, very representative of the country as a whole. Albeit that it is a rural county, and we'll see what that means in a moment. So it's not. It's Middle England, and if you compare with a lot of other places, each dot on here is now I've got to get the terminology right. An SLOA, Mark, is it a super?
Yeah, I think it's lower super output areas. I think it's called.
Which is something which the Office of National Statistics and Department of Community Local Government use to really define at a very low level of the characteristics of an area economically. So we actually, again, it's not an extreme county. So the richest part of Herefordshire, which is St Paul's, it's funnily enough, it's not where Mark lives, but he does add to the GDP quite to the county very significantly. Is 90% of the national centile of income, and similarly the lowest that part is this area called Newton Farm, which is above the worst areas in the country, but still there's a very significant difference between top and bottom there in where people are on the scale depending where they live in the county, and you look at some of the areas. Again, I'm just picking out some of the analysis that's been done, which is that one of the things that really stands out is it may not be that surprising, but here are the data to support this view, is that the most deprived areas have the biggest educational problems. So that 35%, this is saying, of people in those most deprived areas in the bottom left-hand corner of that previous graph come out of education with no qualifications at all. And equally, go to the other extreme, even at when you look at the level 4, that's graduates. Out of the most deprived areas, they're way behind the rest of the country, rest of Herefordshire and the rest of the country. So it's starting to point at areas where investment, going back to Mark's points before, where investment might have the most impact. Another of our streams is, as we've been talking about, is agriculture, and this illustrates one of the points Mark was just making. This is a rural county where agriculture is very, very important to it. And this graph, I know if you could quickly look at it, shows on the x-axis is the contribution to the GVA, which is the best measure we've got of economic activity in the county. And on the y-axis is the contribution to the CO2 emissions, which we're taking as a proxy for pollution as a whole. And you can see that agriculture, although this is an agricultural county, famous for Herefordshire cattle, and a very big part of the county, one would think, has a relatively small impact on GVA, but a huge impact on the emissions from there. And then if you go into the next big box that's in yellow, which is manufacturing, you'll see, and a lot of that is actually connected to the agricultural sector, because when you go delve into it, a lot of it is food production. So you can see from this picture quite quickly that we're not saying here that agriculture and manufacturing just stop it. This sort of goes to one of the points made earlier. These are the middle bucket ones, which is how do we transform those very important to the sectors to the county, but transform it so that they're not generating as much in the way of CO2 emissions and other pollutants. And one of them, which was discussed, and this is early analysis, and it's not been brought very closely down. There's not been a huge amount done to bring it right down to the level of the county, but one of our number is who has been investigating this. That gives the sort of trends. Again, we're going to the putting some numbers beside the things that Mark was just talking about, in terms of if you start to change the production of food and the diet of people, not by turning everybody vegan, as he said, but just turn down the dial of the amount of land that just goes over to beef and animal production, and start to move it towards more in the way of cereals, other arable, and forest. That will have a very dramatic change on effect on CO2 emissions by 2030, if one can bring about that change. I'm doing a very quick a flyover of this. As we go towards this, we're going to be producing policies for in all those three areas, and of course there are trade-offs. And just to prove that we all were in a firm that at one stage knew a lot about systems engineering, we're going to have a systems diagram. And this again is in its infancy, but what we're doing is getting across to the people in the project and then to the wider stakeholders around the county, this idea of how do we measure the trade-offs so that you can bring about all these improvements in the county without just turning the tap off on one. So you have to continue to grow the economy at the same time as making it fairer and making it greener. So that's the sort of the thinking that's been done. We're making progress with the analysis. We're beginning to connect with many more of the council, the local movers and shakers, and by the middle of this year we issued an interim report which we presented to a group of about 50 before Christmas, and we should have a whole series of proposals with plans prepared by about the middle of the year. Right, David has asked, on my chart CO2 sector, where is the massive domestic heating, energy and CO2 load?
I think that was under utilities.
That was under utilities, yeah. which isn't that great compared with what industry is producing. So that's one of the projects that Mark has got some of us working on. And I should say there are probably half a dozen XPA people have been involved or are involved in that now. And we are also recruiting through them others to assist us in some of this analysis. Owen.
Maybe while Owen's on mute, Jeremy, Adrian's made a comment that the agri change is already in flux. I mean, Adrian, did you want to expand on that until we get Owen comes back on?
Yeah, it's just that my life's work has been focused on greening up the environment, but very recently I've connected with, because I'm also director of a very small water company, private sector water company, and we're concerned about water, wastewater, the pollution of water, all of those things, and runoff from agriculture, etc. It's got me involved in a project which is my own initiative, based in partly in Mallorca, where I spend half my time, and that is to focus on the regenerative agriculture, which is the buzzword, or permaculture some people use. And that is a replacement for the damage we're doing as mankind to the soil, which is one of the biggest carbon sinks, as I think we've been told already. And the process has been accelerated because under the Common Agricultural Policy, it's all about production, irrespective of how it's produced, and that leads to large-scale farming, focusing on one or maybe two crops a year, depending where you are, whereas under the new policy, the government is pushing and testing and trialing, is to pay the farmer for public services, which are to actually bring back the environment, bring back the habitat, as well as obviously producing food. Not all land is good for food production. And that introduces the concept already said about tree planting, which again is another initiative I won't bore you with, but I'm very conscious that with all the billions of trees we need to plant, we're going to plant those trees. So one of my other involvements is to launch what I'm calling the tree planting army, which is taking scarred children or scarred teenagers off the street, if you like, giving them a dose of nature in order to get them back to thinking about the future, and also leaving that project or program through some sort of nature-based activity, planting trees, digging ditches, constructed wetlands, and all the other things that are going to reduce climate change. And that's another of my projects and my own pursuit, as it were. Again, based on what I understand is needed and is required. And for those who know me well, that's partly why I decided I needed to take time out of the terrific social environment of the para committees, as it used to be called. So thanks for the moment of time to air my thoughts.
Well, Adrian, we need to speak again, because the tree planting army is just one of the, would be excellent. If we could offer you a test bed in Herefordshire, I think we could probably have something to talk about together. So we'll definitely do that.
I'd love to do that.
And yeah, one of the benefits of no longer being, as you say, common agricultural policy is the changing government policy. I don't think that it's yet clear what is going to happen.
No, it's not.
It'll all be different in 5 years' time. So
Yes.
I think there's a degree of frustration amongst the farming community as to what the future holds. But I'm sure it'll all be fixed. But yeah, we'll pick up on the tree planting.
So I'll talk about the Generation 99 project, where we're a long way away from being as developed as Jeremy. But as Mark had mentioned, one of the projects we were aimed at is getting the youth of the country to believe that they can make a difference. That's the whole point. So that by 2050, when we're all in our wheelchairs, they will be basking in the fruits of their labours. But as you probably realise, whilst this may sound simple, it's in fact quite complicated and difficult for a host of reasons. But the rationale for the project is shown quite clearly by these two slides I'm just about to show you. And I hasten to add that they're not making a political statement, but they're merely making a statistical fact. So many of the 18 to 34-year-olds that we're actually trying to get, because they're the guys who are going to be around in 2050, didn't vote in the Brexit vote in 2016. You can see here some 6 million of them, and we don't know why that is. It probably includes, the reasons include indifference, mistrust, inconvenience, and maybe a feeling it didn't matter whether they voted or not. But as we can see in this slide, if they had voted in the same proportion as the 75 plus age group, then Remain would have won. Now, I'm not making a political comment about this, it's just a statistical fact. And the moral of the story that we're trying to get across to the 18 to 34-year-old and younger than that is that if you do take part, you can make a difference. So with that rationale, we're setting out to energize the younger generation, but we do have a number of problems. And you must realize that we're at the beginning of this, and we're at the moment, we're nailing jelly to the wall. And we're having difficulty finding both the hammer, the nail, the jelly, and the wall. So we're a bunch of middle-class retired old fogies who don't really understand what is troubling anybody under 40. We think we might have a clue, but we're trying to find out. We don't know what problem we need to address, except in very broad terms. So why is it that the 18 to 34-year-olds are indifferent quite often to politics? Why are they disillusioned? And what is it that they want to happen? We can't easily access the full demographic spectrum of young people. We are, as I'll talk about later, we have a group set up, and we can actually analyze, broadly speaking, people doing A-levels, middle class, educated, graduate, young working professionals. We can't find people who left school at 16 and are on the dole very easily. And we need to talk to those people because they're a very large part of the picture. So to find suitable characters who are motivated to be involved is difficult. And actually that's a self-perpetuating problem because by definition, they're not interested. Otherwise they'd be involved. So we have therefore set up a group with school age undergraduate and young working members, as well as the old fogies. And what we're doing is we're carrying out a series of interviews with people to ascertain, and this is hopefully mostly young people, to ascertain what worries them, what they would like to see improved, and what they see as their part in the process. And we've so far carried out about 20 of these interviews, we haven't done any analysis yet, but we've got a meeting on Friday, and we're beginning to think about some analysis. We have some more interviews coming in on Friday. I know there's a young girl, a 16-year-old girl in South Wales, who's been in contact with me over the last 10 days or so, who is interviewing away with people. She's very concerned that she's going to get the wrong demographic, but I've said that all demographics are relevant. And there's another guy who's actually ex-college school Wimbledon, and that's my phone going, so apologies for that, who is also coming on Friday with a number of interviews. So we're hopefully up to 25 or 30 by then, and we'll begin to analyze the results. But this is going to go on for quite a long time until we can actually develop a mission statement and then begin to design a project. I think the difficulty is amply illustrated by a real response that was done to an interview for a different project some years ago in Glasgow by one of the guys who's on our group. And the subject in Glasgow was asked what it was they would like to change about their lifestyle. And the response in best para-handy-ease, and I apologize to anybody from Glasgow, was something along the lines of, "Pal, we haven't got an effing lifestyle." So you can see the problem and the sensitivities. So our immediate objective is to define, using interview data, our mission, which will allow us to do all those good project things that Jeremy talked about, which is design the project, and in the longer run, to hand the whole thing over to a group of infused and eager youngsters, which will enable us old fogies to gracefully fade away into the hinterland, the distance, the past or the future, or whatever you would like us to fade into. So if any of you know of any eager or not so eager under 30s who would like to take part, please let me know. And actually, it would be great if anybody that you could think of, you could put in touch with me, because we would like to increase the spread across the whole country. I understand we probably won't be changing the demographic too much, but the wider we go, the better information we'll be getting. So that's a very brief run through that. We've got miles to go, and as Mark says, I think it's going to be a very, very long running project.
Oh, and it sounds like you're on a recruitment drive now for your next gen project. So I think is your ask of the audience for if there are any next gens to send them your way to help get the pipeline going for this.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
they'd be most welcome. And we've got a briefing document, and we can send all that.
I'm conscious that we're at time, but I think it's great that the conversation is still live and going. And I can see even on the chat, there's a big debate about renewable resources and trees. So I think you thanking Mark for taking us through the 5 actions and how to address impoverishment. And I think that, Mark, this is a topic you can see the level of interest that we'll need to revisit, and hopefully you can draw on resources here. So I think on the previous session, I know, Mark, you were very open for people who want to get involved. I assume that is the same. So if there are people on the line who have not been involved or approached Mark directly, either send me an email or go direct to the 99%, and I'm happy to collate names and pass them on as well.
Yeah, that's
and then
or people can just sign up on the website, and it literally takes 30 seconds to do that. So if anybody wants to, it's 99-percent.org, 99%.org. If you sign up there, then if you leave a message, we know what you're specifically interested in, and if you just want to be kept up to date, then you can just ask for a newsletter.
So that's great, and I'm sure we can add that back into maybe a recap email. And then Jeremy, I think the tree conversation has evolved. So Hereford now reforestation, or whether it's rewilding, I think there's a huge more to be followed up on that. And I'd almost kind of reach out. I can see between Adrian and David Shannon, there's a lot of debate on the pros and cons. So maybe that's a topic to revisit on a future webinar. And then Owen, I think you engaging the next generation, particularly as it comes to elections and many other important things, is really, really important topic. So with all of that, I'd like to bring this to a close. Thank you, our esteemed speakers. The next webinar that we have is on April 6th, and Claire Burks will be taking us on a tour of H&M Bermondsey. And so we will be sending out, in fact, Owen does all the hard work on this. So Owen will help us get a flyer out, and we will hopefully see you all again soon, and we can revisit some of the topics. And again, if there's any other ideas for themes that we would like to have on these calls, please do send us an email, and we'll see if we can get them organized for future sessions. Thank you all.